In modern-day London, among its historic sites is the Brompton Cemetery. Originally called the West London and Westminster Cemetery. Since 1852, the first and only London cemetery to be property of the Crown. The cemetery was established by an Act of Parliament in 1839, as one of the magnificent 7 cemeteries named in the Act. Opened in June of 1840, sprawling across 40 acres, it is one of the oldest cemeteries in Britain. Amongst some 35,000 monuments you will find the funerary monument of Dr. John Snow. During his lifetime, the noted physician's work in the fields of the anesthesiology and epidemiology brought lasting changes to surgical procedures and public health to this very day. John Snow was born on March 15, 1811, on North Street, York, England, the first of 9 children born to William and Frances Snow. North Street was one of the poorest neighborhoods in London. And with the danger of the streets frequently flooded by the Ouse River nearby, with its sewage-contaminated water runoffs. Snow's escape from this neighborhood came early in life. In 1827, due to his aptitude for mathematics, he obtained a medical apprenticeship at the age of 14, with William Hardcastle. During his time as a surgeon-apothecary apprentice, in 1832 he found himself treating victims of a cholera epidemic. This being his first encounter with the disease. He continued his education when, in 1836, he was enrolled at the Hunterian School of Medicine in London. While working at the Westminster Hospital, he was admitted to the Royal College of Surgeons of England on May 2, 1838. He completed his studies when he graduated from the University of London, with his MD in 1844. He proceeded to set up his practice in Soho, as a surgeon and general practitioner. Snow had various interests in different fields of medicine, among which was anesthesiology. His interest in respiratory diseases led him to discoveries of neonatal respiration, oxygen consumption, and the effects of temperature changes to the body. As a member of the Westminster Medical Society, he gave multiple lectures and published many articles. His interest in anesthesia began in 1841, and in 1843 he began to experiment with ether, studying its effect on respiration. In 1846 ether was introduced for use in Britain. And in 1847 he published a paper titled, On the Inhalation of the Vapor of Ether, which served as a guide for its use. He conducted clinical studies on the reactions and procedures of anesthesia. By 1848 he had become the most accomplished and sought-after anesthetist in Britain. Chloroform was also introduced as an anesthesia in Great Britain in 1847, by the Scottish obstetrician, James Young Simpson. Of all the available anesthesia of the time, chloroform was the easiest to administer, but it was also very potent. The standard practice of covering the patient's face with a cloth dipped in chloroform sometimes resulted in a loss of a pulse, which could lead to death. Snow came to the realization that the drug needed to be administered carefully. His research led him to be able to calculate proper doses for use during surgical and obstetric procedures. He also devised a mask for use in the administering of chloroform, and a device to administer ether safely. Snow went on to use ether, chloroform, and other substances to treat his patients. In his obstetric practice he began to use chloroform during the second stage of labor, to ease the patient's pain without rendering her unconscious. This application of anesthesia during childbirth was thought to be unethical by many other physicians, including the opposition from the Church of England. But when on April 7, 1853, Queen Victoria has John Snow administer chloroform during the birth of her 8th child, Leopold. And again in 1857, during the birth of her daughter Beatrice, brought about the acceptance of obstetrical anesthesia. During the early 1800s, Great Britain was transforming into an industrialized nation. This transformation brought about a mass migration of population from the countryside to the cities. London had become overcrowded with an ever-growing population, the majority of whom lived in squalor, in the densely packed slums. Human waste piled up in the courtyard, and overflowed from the cesspits into the gutters, and into the waterways. Outbreaks of typhoid and scarlet fever became a common occurrence. Then in 1831 a new disease, cholera, made its appearance. And it took epidemic proportions in 1837 and 1838. The medical thinking of the day believed that diseases were caused by a presence of miasma, bad air, a poisonous vapor of decaying matter suspended in the air, which produced a foul odor. They further believed that the fact that the many poor, filthy, and foul-smelling neighborhoods were the focal points of the outbreak is proof of this theory. Households were quarantined in the belief that human contact also spreads the disease. But it did not explain why when two people were exposed to the same source of infection, only one might get the disease. Cholera continued to be deathly, with a second outbreak occurring in 1848 and a third outbreak in 1854. John Snow's research into the causes of the cholera infections goes back to his days at the Newcastle Infirmary during the 1830s. He and a colleague, Thomas Michael Greenough, worked together to conduct their research on the cholera epidemics and continued to do so for many years. In 1849, Snow published his paper on the mode of communication of cholera, in which he proposed that the disease was transmitted as a waterborne infection and not by bad air. His paper was met with very little attention. But after the third outbreak of 1854, in Soho, Snow published an updated version of his theory. This time he was able to provide statistical evidence that he had collected from the area of London around Broad Street. By interviewing the locals as to where they were obtaining their water supply, he was able to trace the source of the outbreak to one particular public water pump on Broad Street. And although his microscopic and chemical analysis could not prove conclusively that the pump was the source, the pattern of disease he recorded convinced the local authorities to disable the pump by removing its handle. After the epidemic subsided, government officials replaced the pump handle, but had no interest in Snow's theory, which they outright rejected. To accept his finding would mean indirectly accepting that the disease was transmitted by fecal contamination of the water supply, which was too unpleasant for the public to contemplate. The thought of unseen diseased organisms in the water was looked on as folly. They and other physicians took pains to discredit him in the tabloids. It wasn't until the cholera outbreak of 1866, 8 years after Snow's death, that one of his distractors, William Farr, realized that Snow's diagnosis was correct, and issued an immediate order that unboiled water was not to be drunk. And even though Farr still denied Snow's finding, he did admit that the water had a role in the spread of the cholera epidemic. Researchers later uncovered that the Broad Street pump's well had been dug only 3 feet from an old cesspit, which had begun to leak fecal bacteria into the well, which in turn contaminated the water the pump supplied. Dr. John Snow's innovative contributions to medical science led the way to safer methods in the administration of anesthetics. His observations and experiments made possible the medical procedures employed by physicians to this day. And his visionary work in determining the mode of transmission of cholera established the scientific field of epidemiology, and further research into germ theory. His insights led to changes in the waste and water systems throughout London and other cities, and to public health throughout the world. In his personal life, Snow was an active swimmer, as well as a vegetarian. He was a teetotaler and drank only purified water throughout his life. Later in life he developed a renal disorder and decided to add meat to his diet, along with a little wine to aid his digestion. Still, in his 40s, his condition continued to deteriorate. It is believed that his experiments with various gases, the hazards of which were unknown in his day, may have contributed to his death. He was working in his office when on June 10, 1858, at the age of 45, he suffered a stroke, and 6 days later he died on June 16. The John Snow Society was formed in 1992, whose members include epidemiologists, physicians, anesthesiologists, and public health officials. and was founded to identify and help solve the spread of disease and epidemics. They meet annually at the John Snow pub in Soho to toast his achievements. And in York, there is a plaque mounted on the Park Inn, on North Street honoring his birth. Medical science owes much to Dr. John Snow. He will always be known as the Father of Epidemiology.